Well, hi guys, Tommy Ellison here. It's Senior Moments. It's 5 o'clock. We're live at 5, and we're on Facebook and on YouTube. And I appreciate you joining in if you are already with me. I see I do have one listener, but that might be me testing the broadcast out over here. Anyway, got a kind of an interesting program for you today because, well, I was flashing back the other day. Somebody was asking me how old I was, and I told them, and they said, "Well, are you retired?" And I said, "Well, no, not really." And they said, "Well, have you been thinking about it?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I have, but that's not to say that I'm going to do it anytime soon. You know, I'm in a marketing job. I don't dig ditches for a living, so it's not like it's a lot of work, physical work for me to continue working. And you know, it's actually a job that I enjoy. So I'm not sure, exactly why I should give it up just for the sake of hitting some magic number. And maybe, some of you are facing this same situation. But, well, anyway, I thought I would comment on a little bit because it got me thinking about my first jobs. Jobs that I had when I was, 15 years old. I was a sophomore or about to be a sophomore in high school there at Fairfield, my alma mater. So I thought I would talk about that a little bit and, just kind of visit it for a moment. So we'll be right back. Like I said, when the person asked me if I was getting ready to retire, I got thinking about it, and I thought, well, I don't really have a firm retirement plan yet. Somebody laughed the other day and said their retirement plan, I guess from a financial standpoint, was to go and fall at Target, and I guess the settlement would, maybe straighten them out. But lately, I've kind of found myself flashing back to a couple of, well, many years ago, actually, thinking about the first three jobs that I had, and just the three completely different worlds that these jobs more or less, survived, I guess. And the reason there were three was because they were summer jobs. They happened between my sophomore, or actually my freshman and sophomore year. So it was the summer before my sophomore year, the summer before my senior year, or junior year rather, and then there was the summer before, following my senior year, that I was about to go away to college. And so those were the three time slots. And of course, I had three completely different type of jobs and three different bosses and, three different kinds of work. But all three of them, in reality, kind of taught me something about life. The first job I had was working in, those of you who grew up in my hometown will remember Erwin Appliance. They sold televisions and washing machines and dryers and deep freezes, the big old chest style deep freezes, as well as the stand up vertical deep freezes. And that was the summer that I became, well, a delivery man. But the first part of that job, like I said, I was 15. In fact, I had to get a worker's permit to actually work there because of being 15. I think if you were 16 in Alabama, you didn't have to have one, but I was 15. And, technically, I guess I was a child. And so I went downtown to the health department, I think, and got a worker's permit to work prior to becoming 16 years old. I always wondered why they needed a permit, but nevertheless, the first thing that Kerry Erwin, who was the owner of Erwin Appliance, Mr. Erwin, I'll call him, because there was a Kerry Erwin Jr., his son, who was actually in my class in high school. But Kerry Erwin Jr., the son, dad, hired me to do a job with two other guys. And the very first day, and it actually lasted what felt like a year and a half, but it was really only a couple of weeks, was unloading a rail car, a train car load of Maytag washing machines. And I mean, it was stuffed to the brim. There, you couldn't have hardly put a slip of paper in that car. It was packed so full of washing machines, the Maytag washing machines. And of course, everybody remembers Mr. Erwin. And so when we were unloading that train car, we would load them up on the back of a pickup truck, and then we would run around to where his warehouse was there on Gary Avenue and unload them, stack them up in the building, and the guys, working there would get ready to sell them. So we were, unloading these washing machines, these Maytags that were stacked inside this really hot railroad car. And it was hard physical labor, as you might imagine. They weighed about, 200-300 pounds apiece, and it took two guys to handle them. And there wasn't any air conditioning. In fact, there wasn't even a forklift. We were doing it all by hand, and it was just basically manpower, or maybe in this case boy power, or child power. Child power. Okay, anyway, child power and sweat. And I was working with a guy, he was actually an alum of Fairfield. His name was Kenneth Spear. Many of you may remember Kenneth. And Kenneth really taught me a lot, because after we finished unloading that train car load, Mr. Erwin said, "Hey, do you want to continue working through the summer? Because I can use you to work with our guys." And we were delivering and setting up refrigerators that were being sold, and freezers, and really a lot of color television sets, because color TV was kind of booming at that point in time. They were basically exploding with popularity, during the mid 60s, and many families, having had black and white televisions that could afford them, those RCA color televisions, were buying them right and left. And Mr. Erwin had the RCA, well, I don't know if it was a franchise, but he sold RCA color televisions. And the problem was, you could walk into the store, buy the television, probably pay cash or maybe even on credit. Who knows? Never got into that amount of detail about it. And then we had to deliver it to the store, pick it up in the warehouse, make sure that the serial numbers were matching the bill of sales. And so Kenny was doing all that paperwork and stuff, and I was just basically waiting for him to finish so we could load it up on the pickup truck and take it to the residence where the purchaser had agreed for it to be delivered. And so, but here was the deal. You didn't just plug them in. You had to install those giant rooftop antennas that were there. And so we that was the challenge that I had of putting those antennas and things as we did those installations of those television sets. I'm just looking at my thing here. We've got I don't know, not sure why that's not coming on here, guys. Here we go. Let's try it this way. Well, okay. I'll come back to that. Like I said, you didn't just plug in the television and the color picture popped up. You had to and see, here's the problem. Because we were in Fairfield and the TV stations were on Red Mountain over in Birmingham, and there were a lot of trees and hills that kind of blocked that line of sight. We had to put a 30-foot tall tower on the television on the roof of the house in order for the signal to have clear line of sight to the radio or the television towers. I'm not going to get technicals. I'm not sure I know how all that works, but nevertheless, we had these long mast poles that we had to carry up on the roof, and we had to, install the pole holder, I guess you would call it, on the crown of the roof, and extend that mast and tie it down so it didn't collapse, place it in the holder, and then we had to run guy wires from different parts of the house itself, up on the roof from the usually from the gutters to stabilize the tower from moving. And then prior to doing all that, we had to hook the cable of the television up to the antenna that was at the top of the mast, run the cable down the mast and down the side of the house, and typically go through the vents that were on the side of the house where the crawl spaces were, into those basements. And a lot of people didn't have like full basements. They just had that 3 or 4 foot tall crawl space that was beneath the main floor of the house and the ground, and then run it back up into the living room where a hole had to be drilled in the floor. And once they got all that hooked up to the back of the television, then Kenny would, stand downstairs and he would yell at me to turn the antenna, and I would turn the mast. I wouldn't tighten it down until he told me what the signal was. So he's saying, turn it, and wait, go back, go back, go back. And he's basically looking at the picture on the television screen, trying to get the best reception by us manually turning that antenna. It was a lot of work. And finally he would yell, stop. And when he did, I would tie it down, tighten it down so that the mast couldn't continue to turn. And Kenny did his job, I did my job, and there we are, showing the owner how to get channel 6 and 13 and 42 in beautiful color on their new RCA television. Now, I got to tell you, there were some interesting adventures dealing with those crawl spaces, because when you crawl under a house, first of all, it ain't your house, and secondly, you don't have any idea what's underneath there. There were spiders everywhere. Of course, there was always this expectation of uncovering a snake, and not to say that I never saw a snake, saw a few spiders, and I'm not crazy about spiders, but, we were, regardless of whether we saw the snake, we were convinced that they were there, so we were always on the lookout. In fact, I heard a story about a guy that did a similar job that we did, and he wore a pager. You remember pagers that vibrated, and he was crawling under the house, and he got to thinking about those snakes, and about that time his pager went off, and he's laying on his stomach crawling under the house. And when that pager went off, of course, it felt like he had just crawled on top of a rattlesnake that was starting to shake those rattles. And he didn't have a heart attack, but I think he came that close. But anyway, that was the challenge of doing refrigerators. And then, television sets. And then there were the refrigerators. Patty, I'm going to get you up here, right? Just like that. She says, I'm here. Okay. Thank you, Patty. Glad you're here, dear. When the refrigerators were being sold, and of course they were popular as well, stand-up refrigerators. And the problem was it was like a novel idea back then that all the refrigerators that were, I guess people could afford the models that had water ice makers in them, and cold water dispensers. And the problem was, it wasn't just a matter of bringing the refrigerator to the house, opening up the shipping crate, getting it inside with a pair of hand trucks, getting it in the kitchen. Then the real work started, where you had to drill a hole in the floor and run copper tubing down through the floor of the kitchen, and then try to get underneath the house, once again in that crawl space, and find a water line, cut off the water, drill a hole in the water line, put a coupling on there so that you could turn the water on and off there, and then turn the water back on, make sure it's not leaking, and then come out of the crawl space, go upstairs, hook the water line into the back of the refrigerator. Again, hook it together, make sure it's not leaking, turn it on, make sure it's not leaking, and then execute the water supply there inside the refrigerator. And all that, crawling around and running around in the crawl space was just another day in the life of us guys that were, delivering these refrigerators. What were we making? I don't know about Kenny. He might have been paid more than in fact, I'm sure he probably was. But me being I guess this was the year before, like I said, it was before my sophomore year, I guess, $1.65 an hour. And man, I thought I was getting rich. I really did. It wasn't a lot of money now, but it seemed like a lot of money back then. $1.65, which was minimum wage. Also, let me just leave this comment thing up here. Got a couple other people. David Easley, Phil Leon. Wow, hey, Phil. David, Kyle Hewlett are listening in while returning from a golf trip to Biloxi. Well, guys, glad to have you on the program, or actually listening on the program today. Y'all be sure and be careful driving back from Mississippi. Anyway, the second job that I had prior to my senior year, I guess it was, or maybe it was I'm confusing myself now, but it was the second real job, was at a company called Hanna Steel. And it was over in Fairfield, kind of off the beaten path. And the job, I think my aunt actually got me the job. She worked there as a secretary or something. And so I went to work there at Hanna Steel when high school let out. And the work there at Hanna Steel, it was a non-union shop, for one thing. And I say that because the only real safety equipment that we were given was a pair of terry cloth gloves, pink terry cloth gloves that we used to handle the steel components. In fact, the first job that I got there was building pallets, wooden pallets that they would stack these fabricated steel panels on that they were making from. They were taking big coils of steel, cutting them down into small coils to some specific size based on the order that they were trying to fulfill. And these wooden pallets were used to place those steel plates, band them up after they were stacked up. But we were building the pallets outside in what they called the carpenter's shop. And we were using, of course, the terry cloth gloves like the rest of the plant to handle the wood, to more or less minimize the opportunity for splinters and stuff like that. And, typically when the terry cloth gloves got worn out to the point where there were holes in the palm of the glove, you would go over to your foreman and he would send you to the office and say, I need a new pair of gloves. And typically the guy would say, just turn them inside out, or turn them over. In other words, the palm of this hand would become the backside of the other hand, because they were, I don't know if you'd call that ambidextrous or not, but you could reverse them, and the holes now were on the back of your hands, and you had what was the back of the glove now on the palm of your hand, and no holes. And so that was their answer to giving you replacement safety equipment. And about the only time you actually got a pair of new gloves is when both sides of the gloves were actually worn out. But I'm building these wooden pallets. And like I said, they were used for stacking the steel. And I got to tell you, it was hard labor. It was hot during the summer outside. There was sawdust and, nails and splinters. We were building these things out of 4x4s. This is the profile by some length. And it wasn't a fun job at all. And the guy that worked out there said about 3 words a day. And so it wasn't a very social job. And typically 2 of the 3 words was correcting me on doing something wrong. And he was cutting them and I was nailing them together with a power nailer. If you remember the movie Die Hard, I think it was, where he shot the guy with the power nailer. That's kind of what I was dealing with. But I eventually moved indoors. I got promoted, moved inside, no hot sun, no pay increase. But I think I did get new terry cloth gloves for a while. And it was machine work. It was part of the process of taking those coils and refabricating them into steel pieces and components of different sizes and shapes. And I worked on machinery that was actually cutting the big coils into smaller coils. And it was industrial atmosphere. It was loud. It was dirty. The sparks were flying everywhere from time to time. Steel wasn't being made. It was just being refabricated into some size and description for whatever the specification was. But I did learn a few lessons there. Manufacturing work was serious business. And the men, they worked hard. I think I did too. And they never seemed to stop moving. But unfortunately, even though I got a, quote, promotion, I still made $1.65 an hour. I can remember one incident in the plant where a black man who was working on a machine that stamped out and cut those plates pushed his hands under too far, and that blade came down and lopped off all of his fingers, and he went running into the office screaming. Blood was squirting everywhere. The secretaries were about to faint, and they called an ambulance, but they said, no, let's get him in a vehicle and get him to Lloyd Nolan Hospital. And about the time they left, another black dude that was working on the machine with him came in with terry cloth gloves, and his fingers were inside of it, and said, y'all may need these, and gave them to him to take to the hospital. And that was the second job. In fact, when I left Hanna to go to summer workouts for football in mid-August, there was a gentleman, a boy, a few years older than me, who was working on the same equipment that I was. We worked side by side. He was actually on a baseball scholarship to Troy University, and you'll recognize the name. It was Hank Erwin. And Hank, whose dad was a famous World War II Medal of Honor winner, I think. He was working there in the plant with me, and it wasn't but maybe a week or two after I stopped working there that one of those coils fell and hurt his foot. I think it cut off half of his foot, and of course he consequently lost his baseball scholarship at Troy. And if you remember the movie Woodlawn, the guy that played the chaplain was named Hank, and that was Hank Erwin. And he makes a comment in the movie about they asked him if he had ever played football, and he said, no, but I played baseball, but I lost my scholarship due to an injury. And so that was something that actually happened. Had I been there a week longer, by the grace of God, go I guess is what I'm saying here. But that was a tough job. And job number 3, prior to going off to college, between my senior year and freshman year in college, was working for the state highway department. And it was what they called a bridge job. It was not a bad job to have. We were working for the state of Alabama, and the location of where we were working was over on what would eventually become I-65, just north of Birmingham, headed towards the Findlay Avenue exit. All those overpass bridges that were built in the swamps over there to carry traffic were the bridges that we were working on this engineering crew that the state of Alabama had placed there. And so when I came in, they were already working on one bridge right there at Findlay Avenue. In fact, there was a problem with it, and the grades that had been set for the footings were off slightly, and they were trying to figure out how to correct those. And it was a neat job actually, because there was mud and there was rain, but we didn't really work in the rain. A lot of heavy equipment moving around, and bulldozers and dump trucks. It was Robert Gant's dream to see all these big animal machines, that is, and the concrete crews that were pouring concrete. But there was a little construction shack that was located over in North Birmingham, slightly off of the road beds that were being cut in. And that's where the employees would go to eat lunch, or we would meet there in the morning to load up and go to the actual job site, as it were, that was probably a half a mile away in the swamp. And my job was essentially to hold the rod where I was standing on a benchmark, they called it, and we would, the engineering assistant would shoot the levels. It wasn't a transit, but it was a level that would shoot the levels or the elevations off of the ground for the building of these bridges and the abutments and all of the pillars of concrete that, or I should say columns of concrete that were having to be set to then place the roadway on top. And so, the bridges had to meet up with the abutments that were already poured. And so it was a lot of precision work, but, basically I held a rod to give him a point of reference on his level. And the neatest thing about the job was when it rained, the crews didn't work, so we didn't work. And we would go back to the shack and play hearts. And as you can picture, 4 guys sitting around a little makeshift table playing hearts, waiting for the rain to stop, drinking coffee or Cokes or whatever we managed to drag into that hut. And didn't have a refrigerator or anything. We would just go and get soft drinks and tell war stories. But man, did I learn to play hearts that summer. I got really, really good at it. I had never played hearts before. If you've ever played hearts, it's kind of like rook in reverse. But anyway, I became a pretty decent card player that summer. And to be honest, it was probably one of the most valuable things that I learned there was trying to play hearts. We didn't play for money, but man, the idea of making big money for the highway department really didn't pan out because, and I don't know why, but the state of Alabama, the minimum wage rate for their employees was $1.35 an hour. That was less than Erwin and Hanna Steel. Now, granted, the job was a little easier, but this was just the minimum wage for the state of Alabama when the rest of the state was, or businesses were required to pay the $1.65. Never thought that was very equitable for employees of the state. But it was easier physically. It was a little more laid back. It didn't involve crawling under houses, and it didn't involve railroad cars full of washing machines. Patty had commented, she said her first job was at Fairfield Trucking Company. I can't say that I remember that company, but everybody had a first job. In fact, if I'd be interested if you would to put in the comments what your first job was and how much money you were making. If you're watching this, either live or on the replay. But it was funny. The guys that were on the crew of the highway department, the engineering assistant and the civil engineers that were working there with us, were encouraging me to take the highway department test to become a engineering assistant. I guess they were looking for people with a little bit of sense, and they said, you ought to take that test. And so one day they allowed me to go over to the highway department offices and take the test, and I did. And they didn't tell me right away whether I'd passed it or not, but they actually mailed it to me and said I had passed. This was probably 3 weeks after I took the test. But they said, unfortunately, there are no openings at the time, but they would hold my test results and my name and information on file. And oddly enough, about a year later, I got a letter from the state of Alabama asking me if I was still interested in the job as an engineering, what they called an EA1, which was the entry-level engineering assistant. And the pay, $1.65 an hour. Big bump. Big bump. No improvement over the 2 previous summers, just maintaining the status quo. But I had to turn them down because, well, I was already in college trying to keep my grades up to stay in school and play or be eligible to play football. And so anyway, those were the first 3 jobs that I had in my many jobs that I've had over the years, And looking back, there were lessons to be learned in all of them, Work was different back then, in my opinion. Nobody asked if it was fulfilling to have a job or did it align with my passions. You just worked, and you learned respect, not only respect for yourself, but respect for those guys working beside you, the working men and women, who work there with their hands, that you were assisting and making a little bit of money. But again, in a lot of ways, you were learning about America, appliance stores, steel plants, highway construction. Those were the jobs that built America, and you learned about money. Back then, $1.65 an hour felt meaningful. Funny how perspective changes, but probably most importantly, you learned about people. Every job had its characters. The people, you had storytellers, and you had practical jokers, and you had tough guys. And then, of course, you had mentors as well. Phil Leon, I guess via Kyle's link here, is saying his first job was at Bruno's. His first paycheck for 2 days. Whoops, it went away there, Phil. Hang on. First paycheck for 2 days of work was met by union dues and taxes, I guess deducted, was 63 cents. So what a haul, Phil. That's funny. Anyway, the people that I met, the people that I frankly got close to and respected, and looking back now, those weren't just jobs; they were chapters of my life. Stories about railroad cars and rooftop antennas and crawl spaces and spiders and snakes and steel pallets and wooden pallets and rain delays and playing hearts in a construction shack and watching people respond when you beat them playing hearts and watching them laugh and make fun of you when you lost playing hearts. Those were all stories. And funny how those jobs that we thought were temporary became really some of the permanent memories that stay with us, stay with me forever. 3 jobs, and none of them came with air conditioning. All of them were minimum wage, but maximum memories. And from washing machines to highway bridges, I guess they most importantly taught me how to survive. That and sports and playing for Jimmy Fuller at Fairfield. So anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. I appreciate you tuning in, those of you who are watching live, Patty and all you guys on the way back from golf in Mississippi. Thank you for listening. And for those of you who may listen on the replays, I would love for you, if you would, to tell me in the comments what your first job or two was really like and who it was with and how much you made. I would appreciate you seeing your feedback on that. Maybe we can revisit that in a future episode of Senior Moments. If you would, stay with me. I'm going to run a little reel here. And the guy talking is, he's very humble, and he is going to give you some good information about the channel. And I love all of you, and I hope you have a great week, and look forward to seeing you again next week on Senior Moments, the evidence of a misspent youth. Good evening, and have a great week. Bye-bye. Well, hey, thanks for spending a few minutes with me on Senior Moments. If you enjoyed the ride, be sure and tap that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'll be back soon with more stories from a misspent youth, and maybe some of yours too.